Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 68. The Wandering Sultan. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the march of the Third Crusade across Anatolia. How the Holy Roman Emperor had made a deal with the Roman Sultan. A deal that Kılıç Arslan was completely incapable of enforcing, as the wild tribes and the son of the Sultan attacked the Crusaders. We ended with the defeat of Kutub al-Din Melik Shah and Barbarossa taking the walls of Konya. Whatever authority the Limping Lion had retained over Anatolia evaporated. And today, we will discuss the aftermath of this great catastrophe. We will see the Sultanate of Rum effectively collapse as a unified state. And we will end by saying goodbye to the Limping Lion and by bringing to the throne the next Roman Sultan, a certain half-Greek, half-Turkish Seljuk prince currently sitting on the far western fringe of the Sultanate's territory. Now to begin, when Barbarossa descended through the Cilician gates on his way to drown in a river, the Sultanate of Rum was in full-out collapse. The Limping Lion had been revealed to be a powerless, ancient figurehead. He had been totally unable to control the tribes or his sons, and he had seen his own capital, Konya itself, taken by the infidel, though thankfully not destroyed or even really harmed at all. Kılıç Arslan's control over the state was shattered. In a sense, however, we need to see this as the end of a long process. The reality was that ever since 1186 and the partition of the Sultanate, Kılıç Arslan's power has been draining away. There had been rebellions of the Turkmen throughout the 1180s, and then, in 1189, mere months before the arrival of the Holy Roman Emperor, a great war between the Sultan and his eldest son, Kutub al-Din Melik Shah. Therefore, in a sense, it was not so much that the Crusader invasion caused the collapse of the Sultanate. It is more that the arrival of the Crusaders was the straw that broke the camel's back. The state ruled from Konya had been barely holding itself together, and now it totally fell apart. Things started off, perhaps unsurprisingly, with Kutub al-Din Melik Shah making a play for the throne. Kutub al-Din Melik Shah was, after all, the eldest of the Limping Lion's sons, but more importantly, he happened to be the guy with the army in the field nearest to Konya. Now, of course, the army that he had assembled to defeat the Crusaders had, of course, been mauled. However, it was still more than enough to take Konya. The capital's walls had, of course, fallen to the infidel, meaning that the gates were probably in ruins. Moreover, the only force in the city was whatever men had managed to survive the battle with the Crusaders. There was basically nothing protecting the aging Sultan of Rum, a man whose legitimacy had just been shattered. Therefore, basically immediately, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah gathered up the remnants of his army and rode into Konya unopposed. The capital of the Sultanate of Rum was now in his hands, as was his aging father. This seems to have presented Qutb al-Din Melik Shah with a quandary. He seems to have not actually wanted to kill his father, which would of course have been the result back in the steppe world. I think we all know how stories like this mostly go. The loser strangled with a bowstring so as to not spill his royal blood. A commandment of Tengri that had survived the coming of Islam. However, this seems to have not been possible or perhaps desirable. This is likely a sign of the continuous cooking of the Seljuks of Rum. In the Perso-Islamic world, after all, it was anathema to kill your father, and as the court became increasingly Persian, increasingly Islamic, it appears that this traditional option of the Turkish political world was closed. Therefore, instead of getting a bowstring around the neck, Kılıç Arslan II was basically locked up in a room in Konya, still nominally the Roman Sultan. But although he held the capital of Konya and the Sultan, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah's rule was not suddenly recognized by his half-brothers. And think about it, why would it be? Qutb al-Din Melik Shah was not some guy who had defeated the other claimants to the throne, or even defeated the infidel in the Great Jihad. He was a guy who had been defeated by his brothers before the walls of Konya, and then had basically got his ass kicked by the Holy Roman Emperor. The guy who had started a war with the infidel and then lost it, leading to the fall of the capital. The other Seljuk princes just were not going to listen to him, and it appears likely that he only ever really retained the support of the princes ruling Ankara and Çankırı, which I would note were quite close to his home base in Sivas. Effectively, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah appears to have controlled an L-shaped chunk of central Anatolia, stretching from Konya and Aksaray north to Ankara and Çankırı, and then from there east towards Sivas. Basically, aside from that, every single other son of Kılıç Arslan, the Seljuk princes now ruling Anatolia, decided that all of this was nonsense. They weren't going to listen to Qutb al-Din Melik Shah or the Sultan that he now had under his control. In effect, these Seljuk princes now sort of started acting like Kılıç Arslan had died, like the civil war for the throne that inevitably followed the death of a Turkish ruler had begun, even as their ancient father continued to cling to life, locked up in Konya. Archaeologists have discovered coins minted in the names of these Seljuk princes across Anatolia, and I think that we can say with certainty that each of these Seljuk princes ordered the khutbah to be read in their own names in the mosques that they controlled. For his part, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah decided that this just wouldn't do, of course. He had not yet declared himself to be the Sultan, but he was determined to become the master of Turkish Anatolia. So the very next year, in 1191, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah assembled an army and decided to ride east. And the target won't surprise anyone at all. You guessed it, of course, Malatya. As always, the great eastern city was seen as absolutely critical by the ruler in Konya. Malatya controlled some of the key passes to and from the plateau, and was critical to both holding the east and controlling the connection of Anatolia to the heart of the Muslim world. And Qutb al-Din Melik Shah decided that he would not march out alone. His elderly father would accompany him on the campaign, almost certainly so that he could be kept an eye on. Currently, in 1191, Malatya was ruled by another of Kulich Arslan's sons, Muiz al-Din. However, Muiz al-Din, hearing of the approach of his half-brother, decided to reach out to Saladin, currently embroiled in a bitter struggle with Richard the Lionheart. Terms were quickly agreed to, and Muiz al-Din married a daughter of Saladin's brother al-Adil, currently ruling Diyarbakir and northern Iraq on behalf of the great conqueror. This Ayyubid alliance seems to have scared off Qutb al-Din Melik Shah. He was just in no position to attack the son-in-law of the Ayyubid house and had no interest in damaging his relations with Saladin. Instead, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah diverted his army to Kayseri, currently ruled by yet another son of Kulich Arslan, a guy named Nureddin Sultan Shah. Now, Kayseri was, of course, absolutely critical for the Sultan to control. The ancient city was, once upon a time, one of the greatest in Anatolia, though it had entered into a serious decline since Manzikert, and it would not really regain its old level of wealth or prestige until the coming golden age of the Seljuks of Rum. Nevertheless, the city was still at this time crucial to controlling the rich lands of Cappadocia. Though today famous for its alien landscape, cave cities, waterfalls, and hot air balloons, Cappadocia was at this time more important as an incredibly fertile land with amazing pasturage, and as crucial to controlling central Anatolia. This was, after all, where the passes from Marash entered the plateau, and controlling this region, the very center of Anatolia, was absolutely critical to cementing the authority of the Sultan of Rum. Therefore, Qutb al-Din brought his army to the walls of Kayseri and put the ancient city to siege. The forces of Nureddin Sultan Shah resisted, of course, and the siege appears to have become bogged down, leading to disorder in the ranks of the besieging army. See, for us modern people, on the rare occasions when we think about medieval sieges, it is usually in a pretty sanitized context, like a video game or a movie, where there are two armies neatly opposed with a totally surrounded city and then a great charge of the walls, cue ending credits. But that's not really how sieges worked in practice. They were actually long and grueling, with honestly a lot of boredom on each side as men just kind of sat around all day. There was basically a massive camp outside the walls to support the besieging army, and there were often people even running back and forth across the no man's land in between the two sides. The besieging army would also send raiding parties out to the neighboring countryside to ravage, pillage, and rape, and often disease would break out in the camp itself. As such, as sieges dragged on, the besieging army would often become restless. In short, the environment of a medieval siege, especially for the army outside the walls, was kind of a chaotic environment in many ways, particularly as the sieges dragged on. As a side note, I would actually really recommend the novel The Siege by the Albanian author Ismail Kadare, set during an Ottoman siege in Albania. The novel has a great depiction of the camp of a besieging army in the late Middle Ages or early modern period, and functions as a veiled but biting critique of the Enver Hoxha regime. Meanwhile, though, back in our story, as the siege of Kayseri dragged on, as order in the camp of the besieging army began to fray, a certain aging sultan found a chance to make a break for it. Kılıç Arslan had, of course, hated his imprisonment at the hands of his eldest son, and now, with Kutub al-Din Melikshah distracted by the siege, and with the natural chaos of the camp providing an opening, on some summer night in 1191, the Limping Lion limped out of the camp surrounding Kayseri. Before Kutub al-Din Melikshah could do anything about it, the Roman Sultan was gone, riding away from his filial jailer. As he rode away from Kayseri, Kılıç Arslan II surveyed his limited options. He could not return to Konya. His capital was in the hands of men loyal to Kutub al-Din. Returning there would be like escaping from one jail cell to go into another. Nearby Aksaray, then a great city, was also in the hands of allies of Kutub al-Din, as were Ankara and Çankırı to the north. There really was no good place to flee to. The only thing to do was to make for a city ruled by another one of his sons. And thus the wandering of the Limping Lion began. The man who was, in name, the Sultan of Rum, the ruler of Anatolia, was basically reduced to a vagabond. For many months, the old man traveled across Anatolia, first from one son, then to another, trying to convince them not just to host him, but to support him, to take the armies and the satrapies that he had given them in the partition of 1186 and support their father in his just struggle to regain his throne. Now, the Islamic histories look extremely favorably upon the wanderings of the Roman Sultan. The great Seljuk-name, which is going to become a key primary source from here on, indeed compares the wandering of Kılıç Arslan to the trials of the heroes of the Shahnameh, and even to the Hijra of Muhammad from Mecca. However, at the time, I think it was a far more pathetic sight. Imagine that you're some son of Kılıç Arslan, set up in Tokat or Niksar or Elbistan or something, and suddenly your aging father shows up at your door. Ever since 1186, you've been the real ruler of this patch of Anatolia. You know all about the disaster of the Crusader invasion, of course, and you obviously have no interest in submitting to your elder brother Kutub al-Din Melikshah. But what does this ancient man, insisting that he is the Sultan of Rum, have to offer you? He doesn't have a capital, he doesn't even have an army. Indeed, he wants to use your army to go fight Kutub al-Din Melikshah, to put himself back on the throne. Yeah, he's your father, and that imposes some sort of filial responsibility on you to host him. And of course, you're not going to go turn him over to your enemy, but come on. At this point, he's basically just like an old, rambling man, bitterly going on about what he is owed. And of course, it would soon then become apparent to Kılıç Arslan that whichever son he was talking to at the time was just not going to help him. And so the Limping Lion would then saddle up and ride off again, no doubt, cursing his worthless progeny as he rode away. But then, Sometime in late autumn 1191, the Limping Lion made it to the far west of his sultanate, or what used to be his sultanate, to Kütahya and Uluborlu, the lands ruled by the youngest of all of his son by a Greek concubine who had been sent off to the western fringe of the sultanate to rule over these wild lands on the very edge of civilization, far from the civilized center of the Muslim world. The Limping Lion had come to the court of Khusrev. So what has Khusrev been up to this whole time? Well, unsurprisingly, given that his satrapy was on the far western fringe of the Sultanate, the Byzantine borderlands really, and given his own Greek ancestry and fluency in the Greek language, Khusrev I was enmeshed in the politics of Byzantium in a way that his brothers just really weren't. Khusrev appears to have had dealings with a man the Byzantine chroniclers call the Pseudo-Alexios, a pretender to the Byzantine throne who claimed to be a son of the late Manuel Komnenos, and who had raised an army of Turks and Greeks in the Meander Valley, almost certainly with Khusrev's backing. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, Khusrev was also one of the main backers of the Byzantine rebel general Theodore Mangaphos, who has kind of been popping in and out of our story. Mangaphos was a Philadelphian, that is, a man from the city that is today called Aleshehir. In the chaos following the fall of the Komnenoi, Mangaphos seized control of Philadelphia. He then refused to accept the accession of Isaac II Angelos and had declared himself emperor in 1188. This had led to a war with Constantinople, in which Mangaphos turned to Khusrev for aid. However, the arrival of the Third Crusade convinced him to make peace with Constantinople, and he submitted to Emperor Isaac Angelos in 1189. Though he retained his control over Philadelphia and a decent chunk of western Anatolia. Mangaphos remained an ally of Khusrev, and he still has a role to play in our story. For his part, Khusrev seems to have decided to sit out the march of Barbarossa through his western satrapy. He did not join his half-brother Qutb al-Din Melik Shah in the attack on the Crusaders in violation of Kulich Arslan's orders, but he also seems to have done absolutely nothing to restrain the tribes. The tribes were, of course, a crucial pillar of support for his regime in the West, and he wasn't going to anger them over protecting a Latin army, especially because the Latins were also detested by the other community that he ruled over, namely the Greeks. And remember, as a half-Greek ruler, Khusrev spoke Greek with native-level fluency, and had long been intriguing with the Greek potentate of western Anatolia, Theodore Mangaphos, and in general seems to have had very good relations with the local Greek elites. Indeed, his mixed ancestry was likely why he had been appointed to this far western satrapy in the first place. Therefore, as Barbarossa marched through his territory, the future Sultan of Rum adopted the course of masterful inaction, and waited to see how things would shake out. And what he saw was, of course, the defeat of Qutb al-Din by Barbarossa, the capture of the capital, and Qutb al-Din's seizure of power in the aftermath. And now, his father, the nominal Sultan of Rum, had shown up at his far western court and was pleading for aid after having been rejected by his other half-brothers. However, Khusrev would end up making a different calculation than his half-brothers had made. As he hosted his father, Khusrev got to thinking. His father's plea for aid was not just an annoyance, it was actually a golden opportunity. An opportunity that he couldn't really pass up. See, in the interim, as the Limping Lion had been wandering around Anatolia, in Konya, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah had declared himself to be the Sultan. Like his half-brothers, Khusrev was of course just not going to accept this. But instead of just ignoring Qutb al-Din Melik Shah's rule in Konya and continuing on as an independent bey, Khusrev calculated that aiding the aging Sultan of Rum actually presented an opportunity to seize the state for himself. Let's look at the facts here. Qutb al-Din Melik Shah had been humiliated by Barbarossa. Then he had been scared off of attacking Malatya. Then his prize captive, the aging Sultan himself, had escaped. His rule was not recognized by most of the Seljuk princes now ruling the patchwork of beyliks that constituted the Sultanate of Rum. In short, he was in fact an extremely weak ruler. But in Konya itself, there was still a state, still a court apparatus built during the reigns of Masud and the Limping Lion. A court apparatus that could be used to reassemble the shattered sultanate. And what better way to take control of that apparatus than the noble cause of returning his father to the throne? Putting his father back on the throne would be an act of great filial piety, of course beloved by all those Persian and Arab and Greek and Armenian courtiers, nobles, and bureaucrats in Konya. It was a legitimate action. Furthermore, while his half-brothers were not going to accept Qutb al-Din Melik Shah, they might accept a return to the status quo ex ante, a nominal figurehead on top in Konya. And after returning his father to the throne, then Khusrev, the youngest of all of the Limping Lion's sons, would be in an excellent position to leapfrog his elder half-brothers and seize the throne when his father inevitably died. And really, how long away could that possibly be? I mean, the man is positively ancient now. Furthermore, Khusrev had the troops at his disposal. As we discussed in prior episodes, the major upshot of the Battle of Myriokephalon from the Sultanate's perspective was that it provided a release valve in the west for the wild tribes. Western Anatolia, that is Khusrev's satrapy, was bristling with wild tribes who would aid him in a campaign to the east. A campaign in which Khusrev assured them they would reap the material rewards of victory. Khusrev could also call on the other community that he ruled, the local Greeks, to provide funds, know-how, and perhaps even soldiers in such a campaign. And thus, Khusrev I decided that he would not follow in the footsteps of his half-brothers and dismiss his father's pleas. Instead, he would set out to restore his father to the throne, and also thus set down the road that leads to the throne himself. Over the winter of 1191-1192, Khusrev thus assembled his armies, and, when the snows began to melt, set out for Konya with his father in tow. Unfortunately, we don't have a good account of the battle for Konya. The best primary source about the Seljuks of Rum, the Seljuk Name, was written almost 100 years after these events. Furthermore, its author, Ibn Bibi, was basically patronized by Khusrev's descendants, the future sultans of Rum. But given what is about to happen, the civil war and the temporary defeat of Khusrev that we're going to cover in the next episode actually, he is sort of incentivized to gloss over the details of this early period. Therefore, we're kind of missing the details here. However, we do know for sure that Khusrev was successful. Qutb al-Din Melik Shah was driven out of Konya, and indeed out of central Anatolia itself. He fled back to the east to regroup. Khusrev was thus in control of Konya and promptly restored his father to the throne. Together, father and son then marched out of Konya towards Aksaray, the key city that controlled the route to Konya from the east, and which remained in the hands of an ally of Qutb al-Din. Hopefully, after a victory there, the great Western army led by Khusrev would be able to continue forth and reunite the Sultanate. And though his father was now nominally back in power, I think everybody knew that the Limping Lion was, at best, a figurehead for his youngest son. The symbol of power trotted around by Khusrev as he attempted to seize the state once ruled from Konya. But it was just not to be, at least for now. Because while on the road to Aksaray, the elderly Sultan of Rum sickened. As Khusrev's army besieged Aksaray, the ancient Sultan's health continued to fail him, and he finally did what he should have done years ago. In early 1193, Kulich Arslan II, the Limping Lion, died outside of the walls of Aksaray. Before passing, the Roman Sultan gathered together the officials of his court and those beys and nobles who remained with him and Khusrev, and proclaimed his youngest son to be his heir. Upon his elderly father's death, Khusrev immediately declared himself to be the next Roman Sultan. Khusrev then ordered that the Limping Lion's body be returned to Konya and be buried in the Aladdin Mosque complex that had been expanded during his reign. Kulich Arslan II remains interred there to this very day. And thus began the reign of Khusrev I. Now we are going to cover the reign of Khusrev over the coming episodes. So now, I would be remiss to not end the episode by discussing the legacy of Kulich Arslan II. What can we say about the Limping Lion? Like his namesake and grandfather, the first Sword Lion, Kulich Arslan II has, I think, a complicated and mixed legacy. And also like his namesake, even if he doesn't quite rank as the greatest Roman Sultan, he certainly ranks among the most consequential. In the popular imagination, of course, he is most famous for Myriokephalon, the great battle that cemented Turkish rule over the Anatolian plateau, that lit the hearth of the Turkish nation. And I think he does deserve great credit for that. It was the Limping Lion who defeated Manuel Komnenos and delivered Inner Anatolia to permanent Turkish rule. That by itself cements his legacy and is, I think, a testament to his skill and indeed his greatness as a ruler. But I think that we need to see Myriokephalon as actually something of a capstone achievement. Remember, the Limping Lion started his career as one son among many succeeding the great Mesud, and a son suffering from some sort of physical disability at that. Remember, this is the Middle Ages, A physical disability would have been seen as a great mark of divine disfavor. Yet his skills and talents were nevertheless apparent enough to make him the preferred successor of his father, though of course his reign began with a civil war. A civil war that spiraled out of control, dragging in the greatest powers of his day, and ultimately left him isolated and friendless and groveling for aid from Constantinople, his state on the edge of destruction. He endured the humiliation of the imperial audience in the Queen of Cities, and then rode back home, picked up the bow and arrow, and set out to reverse the situation. And he succeeded wildly, against all odds really. It was Kılıç Arslan who succeeded where his father and his grandfather had failed, who defeated the Danişmend Beylik and truly united Anatolia under the rule of the House of Seljuk. And I would note that he did this not just through war, but through canny negotiations. Indeed, he seems to have had an almost preternatural ability to negotiate from a position of weakness, and he used this to get the better of Roman emperors and Turkish beys, and even the greatest rulers of the Muslim world, Nureddin Zengi and Saladin. He was a skilled and talented ruler, a man who crawled out of a pit dug early in his reign to cement the rule of his state. Additionally, as we will discuss in more detail in a later non-narrative episode, these external conquests were accompanied by solidification of the state in Konya itself. While his father Mesud had begun the Alaeddin Mosque complex and likely began building the Palace of the Sultans on the central hill of Konya, we know from the archaeological evidence that it was really in Kılıç Arslan's reign that these projects were substantially completed, though of course further construction works would come on later. Indeed, the coming flowering of Seljuk architecture beginning in the early 1200s has its roots here, in the work begun by Kılıç Arslan in the late 1100s. We see further evidence of the cooking of the court elsewhere, in the career and works of Kılıç Arslan's talented Grand Vizier, the Greek Ikhtiar al-Din Hasan ibn Gavras, and even in the Persian name from the Shahnameh that he gave to his youngest son and future successor, Kehusrev. These two strands, his external conquests in Anatolia and his internal development of the state in Konya, wove together, and it allowed the Limping Lion to overcome the hardship of the early years of his reign and turn the Sultanate into the master of Turkish Anatolia. And I would note that this in some ways parallels his own life, his own overcoming of his personal physical handicaps. Though sneered at as a cripple by the Roman emperor, the Limping Lion basically conquered Anatolia, culminating in the great victory at Myriokephalon. The victory that in many ways confirmed that Anatolia was to be the homeland of the Turkish people. Had he died then, right after Myriokephalon, the Limping Lion would have gone down in Turkish history as one of the greatest Roman sultans, maybe even the greatest. But as I said, Kılıç Arslan II lived too long. And instead, he grew old and weak until control of the state that he himself had turned into the master of Anatolia, fell from him. The partition of 1186 shattered the Sultanate, and, consumed by Turkmen revolt, the state basically fell apart. And thus, the Limping Lion became the man to not only win one of the greatest victories in Turkish history, but to endure one of its greatest defeats. The disastrous march of Frederick Barbarossa and the very fall of Konya itself to the infidel. The Sultan then ended his career on the run, captured by one of his sons and wandering around Anatolia, bitterly seeking aid to return him to the throne that he had built. It was only the political calculations of the youngest of his sons that allowed him to return to Konya. The aging man, walking with the limp that he had borne throughout his long life, limping back into his capital, a capital that even now did not control all of the sultanate that he had built. And this, too, is a part of his legacy. When evaluating his reign, we cannot just look at the unification of Anatolia and the victory at Myriokephalon and the building of the state in Konya. These were triumphs, indeed great triumphs, but they were matched by defeats nearly as bad. Both the defeats early in his reign that he ultimately overcame, but more importantly, disaster in his later years that undermined everything that he had built previously. We need to not only look at Myriokephalon, but also the disastrous partition of 1186, the massive wave of Turkmen unrest, and the catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Crusaders. These, too, are a part of his legacy, and really what makes his story so tragic. The victor of Myriokephalon, limping around Anatolia, begging his sons for aid. A powerless and broken old man, wandering the land that he had conquered in his youth. So now, the Limping Lion lies dead and buried in Konya, and Khusrev I has declared himself to be the Sultan. But of course, this is not going to be universally accepted. And so next time, the civil war to succeed the Limping Lion, a civil war that in some ways began 5 years before his death, will truly begin. Khusrev will be forced to endure his own years of dust and thorns, as his brother, Rukneddin Suleiman Shah, raises up an army to oppose him. And we will see the war between the brothers end in the reunification of Turkish Anatolia. But also with the man who will ultimately benefit the most from that reunification, sent off into exile with his kinsmen in Constantinople.